Since his return to the White House, President Donald Trump has reignited trade tensions with Canada, imposing sweeping tariffs on nearly all Canadian imports, except one critical resource: oil. This paradox highlights the deep economic ties between the two nations while exposing the political and strategic calculations behind Trump's trade policies. On one hand, Trump has justified tariffs as a means to protect American industries, address trade imbalances, and strengthen national security. On the other hand, his reluctance to impose tariffs on Canadian oil underscores the United States' heavy dependence on its northern neighbor for energy security. Canada is the United States' largest trading partner, with billions of dollars in goods flowing across the border daily. American consumers rely on Canadian agricultural products, auto parts, industrial goods, and raw materials. Yet, under Trump's new tariff regime, many of these imports will now face steep levies, leading to increased costs for U.S. businesses and consumers. However, oil remains untouched. The U.S. imports more crude oil from Canada than any other country, and placing tariffs on it would be economically damaging. American refineries, particularly in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, are designed to process Canada's heavy crude. Without it, the U.S. could face higher fuel prices, supply shortages, and economic disruptions. In this video, we're diving into the complexities of U.S. Canada trade under Trump's tariffs. We'll break down why he's hitting Canadian imports with heavy tariffs, but leaving oil untouched. By looking at economic data, trade deals, and political motives, we'll uncover why, despite all the tough talk on trade, the U.S. simply can't afford to mess with Canada's oil. The economic relationship between the United States and Canada is one of the most significant in the world. Both countries share a border spanning over 5,500 miles, facilitating billions of dollars in trade annually. As neighbors and allies, their economies have become deeply interconnected through trade agreements, supply chains, and shared industries. Historically, U.S.-Canada trade relations have been governed by key agreements such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which was later replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, in 2020. These agreements ensured the free flow of goods between the two nations, benefiting businesses and consumers on both sides of the border. However, Trump's aggressive trade policies, which prioritize American industries, have disrupted this long-standing trade relationship. The imposition of tariffs on Canadian products marks a significant shift in economic strategy, with potential ramifications for both economies. Key sectors affected by Trump's tariffs include agriculture, automotive manufacturing, and steel production. Canada is a major exporter of goods such as dairy products, lumber, and aluminum to the U.S., all of which are now subject to higher import duties. American businesses that rely on Canadian raw materials and components are expected to face increased costs, which may be passed down to consumers. While many Canadian industries face economic hardships due to these tariffs, the oil sector remains an exception. The U.S. relies heavily on Canadian oil, particularly from Alberta's oil sands, to fuel its energy needs. This dependency is one of the key reasons why Trump has refrained from including oil in his sweeping tariff policies, a contradiction that highlights the complexity of U.S.-Canada trade relations. President Trump's economic policy has been centered around his America First agenda, which emphasizes reducing trade deficits and bringing jobs back to the United States. A major component of this strategy has been the implementation of tariffs on foreign goods, and Canada has not been spared from these measures. In 2025, Trump announced a sweeping 25% tariff on most Canadian imports, targeting key sectors such as agriculture, automotive parts, and industrial goods. One of the industries most affected by these tariffs is agriculture. Canada exports a wide range of food products to the U.S., including dairy, meat, and grains. Similarly, the automotive industry, one of the most integrated sectors between the U.S. and Canada, faces significant disruptions. Many American auto manufacturers depend on Canadian-made components, and tariffs could increase production costs, making vehicles more expensive for consumers. Despite the broad range of goods affected, one major exception remains: Canadian oil. While nearly every other major Canadian export faces new tariffs, oil remains untouched, revealing the strategic importance of energy trade between the two countries. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States, providing a steady and reliable source of energy for American refineries. In 2024, Canada accounted for over 50% of all U.S. crude oil imports, with much of it coming from Alberta's oil sands. The U.S. relies on Canadian oil not just because of its volume, but also because of its specific type. Many American refineries, particularly those in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, are optimized to process the heavy crude that Canada produces. If Trump were to impose tariffs on Canadian oil, it could have serious economic consequences. Higher oil prices would increase the cost of gasoline and diesel, affecting transportation, logistics, and everyday consumers. The U.S. could try to replace Canadian imports with oil from other countries, but this would mean relying more on OPEC nations, which could undermine Trump's energy independence strategy. This is why, despite Trump's aggressive stance on Canadian trade, oil remains untouched. The risk of economic fallout is too great, and the U.S. simply cannot afford to sever its energy ties with Canada. The imposition of tariffs on Canadian goods, while sparing oil, has significant economic and political ramifications. For American businesses, higher costs of Canadian imports mean increased production expenses, which often get passed on to consumers. Canadian businesses, on the other hand, are struggling with reduced access to the U.S. market. Politically, these tariffs are straining U.S. Canada relations. While Canada has historically been one of America's closest allies, the imposition of tariffs creates diplomatic tensions. Canadian leaders have criticized Trump's policies, and there is growing pressure within Canada to diversify trade relationships and reduce reliance on the U.S. The future of U.S. Canada trade relations under Trump remains uncertain. If tariffs remain in place, industries on both sides of the border will have to adjust to higher costs and reduced market access. One possible scenario is that negotiations between the two countries could lead to tariff reductions or exemptions for certain industries. Another possibility is that Canada accelerates its efforts to diversify trade relationships, strengthening economic ties with Europe and Asia. Ultimately, the oil trade remains the linchpin of the U.S.-Canada relationship. As long as the U.S. continues to rely on Canadian oil, both nations will have an incentive to maintain some level of cooperation. Trump's tariff policies on Canada present a striking contradiction. While nearly all major imports face heavy tariffs, oil remains untouched. The impact of these tariffs is already being felt across various industries, with businesses and consumers facing higher costs. Looking ahead, the U.S.-Canada relationship will likely be shaped by both political decisions and market forces. Whether Trump's tariffs succeed in reshaping trade dynamics or end up harming both nations remains to be seen, but one thing is clear. When it comes to oil, America still needs Canada.
But one thing we're going to be demanding is we're going to be demanding respect from other nations. Canada, we have a tremendous deficit with Canada. We're not going to have that anymore. We can't do it. I don't know if it's good for them. As you probably know, I say you can always become a state. And if you're a state, we won't have a deficit. We won't have to tariff you, et cetera, et cetera. But